Streaming live. Voila. Okay. So good morning to everyone. Yes, the voice indeed has made itself heard. Good morning. And welcome to History Matters and So Does Coffee. As advertised, today we're going to be talking about propaganda. And before I launch into that, and I'm going to try and determine here, are you available for this, given that you have, okay, dog shenanigans? Okay, so before I delve into the topic, my partner here, Grace, is going to discuss the rules of the game.
All right, good morning. Boy, thank you for being with us here at NCHE this morning. My name is Grace Leatherman. I'm the Executive Director of the National Council for History Education. We are thrilled to be here for History Matters and So Does Coffee. Thank you all for joining us for 97 episodes. We're delighted you're here. We do want to let you know, of course, March 4th is our Joanne's 100th episode, so please join us for that. We're very excited. And also, we're going to be celebrating 100 episodes at our conference with an evening event, History Matters and So Do Cocktails, and that is going to be March 19th, and that'll be at 8 o'clock Eastern. So we do hope you can join us there with your beverage of choice, and look for more information about that. There's stuff coming out on Twitter and in email, so but join us at ncheteach.org for more details on anything. All right, we do want you to participate in the chat, so please let us know what you're thinking as we go, but if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and I will make sure that I ask Joanne those great questions. So thank you all very much, and I will hand it back to Joanne.
Excellent. Okay. Propaganda. So I could have, I suppose, announced this early, because those of you who were here last week heard me say, maybe next week I'll do propaganda. And I probably should have stunned you all by coming up with this topic way early in the week, and yet somehow I didn't. So even so, I am going to be talking about propaganda today, which naturally grows out of last week's topic. We were talking about cartoons. Some of those political cartoons indeed could fit the definition of propaganda, which I'm going to talk about a little bit today. And obviously, propaganda is a long-term phenomenon. It is one that, particularly in our political realm, if you add on the terms misinformation and disinformation and, horror of horrors, fake news, then there's a lot of stuff that might fall under that category. They're not all the same thing, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But for now, I am going to talk a little bit about propaganda in the past, and then, as always, we will segue into the present and talk a little bit about what the past can tell us about the present. Now, as far as defining terms, because as good historians, this is what we do, propaganda basically is information of a biased or misleading nature that's used to promote or publicize a particular political cause or point of view. That's a dictionary definition of what it is. Now, fake news, when you begin playing around, when you begin Googling around for propaganda, what you get is a whole bunch of people trying to determine the difference between propaganda, fake news, and everything else. And many people don't agree. What I can say made sense to me was that not all fake news is propaganda, but some is. So, for example, if there's fake news that's being created more for clickbait than anything else, to get people to click on a site, it's fake news, but not necessarily propaganda. However, strategically designed fake news that's communicating a message in some way, that crosses the line, the sort of blurry line, into becoming something akin to propaganda. So the intent of this, of whatever's being spread, matters a lot here when you're talking about propaganda, as well as the message. The other thing that's true of most propaganda, and this is right in line with something I've talked about a lot on History Matters in the last 97 episodes, is propaganda often is aimed at influencing your emotions rather than really intellectually persuading you. It's about emotion over reason. Often it involves vilifying your opponents. It's an art really of garnering and encouraging emotions of a certain sort to get across a message that helps you and your cause in some way. I know I talk all the time about emotion and politics, partly because that is the thing I am interested in right now, particularly in my own scholarship, but partly because I think it's an understudied phenomenon. And I think it's a vitally important one, particularly now when so much of politics, and particularly among some on the right, is more centered on emotion than it is actually on policy at this point, which means it's really important, as I always say, to think about what emotions people are trying to pull from you rather than immediately responding in the way that perhaps people want you to respond. So in one way or another, propaganda is aimed at pulling that kind of emotion from you. Now, I want to mention the first piece of propaganda I thought of when I thought, I'll talk about propaganda in history, what will I talk about, is a really obvious one, and it might even be one that you teach this way, but I wanted to mention it only because it's so clearly propaganda, and that is Paul Revere's engraving of the Boston Massacre. And most of you, I'm sure, who are following along here have probably seen it. It's a street scene in Boston, and on the right side, I believe, is a line of British soldiers who are shooting into a crowd of colonial subjects, I guess at that point, not yet citizens, of colonists, and some of them are lying in the street dead, and there's even, I think, a sniper in a window or something. There's like a lot happening in that Revere engraving. Now, it's such a useful piece of propaganda that for many of us, it's the image we have of that event, even though there are a lot of things in that image that are not necessarily accurate. So for example, when you look at it, it looks as though the British soldiers are like, ready, aim, fire, and just mowing down these colonists. In fact, what happened was more confusion than anything else. And indeed, the soldiers shot colonists, but it wasn't as though they were deliberately firing into a crowd to kill, crush, and destroy colonists. This particular engraving by Revere makes it look that way, that it was deliberate, that it was manslaughter, right? They were just out to slaughter colonists. The expressions on the faces of the soldiers are kind of angular, and they're intent on what they're doing. In the crowd of colonists, there's a woman, sort of expressing despair, and so gallantry gets sort of swept in. There's even a little dog in the street, right? So Revere, and I'm going to come back in a minute to the fact that Revere probably is not the originator of this image, so it's a little bit of a plagiarism story. But the point of the image being that the evil British deliberately mowed down these colonists, left them in the street with women in the crowd, with man's best friend, a dog right there, people lying dead in the street, the horror, right? And there's even a poem on the bottom of the original image that even more milks that scene for what's happening in that scene, which is not to say that British soldiers shooting and killing colonists is not in and of itself horrifying, bad, and worthy about being upset about. But the image, in the way that Revere depicts it, is particularly aimed at, I didn't mean to use that pun, but I did. There are too many gun metaphors in the English language, but it is particularly aimed at getting people to really hate these British soldiers, getting them to really empathize with the colonists. It's aimed not just at depicting a scene, but at getting you to take sides and to assume good guys and bad guys. In that sense, it really is not just an image, it is propaganda. Now, what's interesting about that particular piece of propaganda, particularly given we all know the image, it's probably in like every textbook that talks about early America, that Revere probably didn't originate the image. He based it on an image by an artist named Henry Pelham, P-E-L-H-A-M. I want to give him credit with his full name, who created the first illustration of it, and he was not credited for his work. And I, on Pelham's behalf, because I feel for him in this case, he actually wrote a letter to Revere in 1770 complaining about this. And I'm going to read you a little bit of the letter because somehow or other it feels, if I'm talking about this, Pelham deserves his due. Pelham says, "Sir, when I heard that you were cutting a plate of the late murder, I thought it impossible, as I knew you was not capable of doing it unless you copied it from mine. And as I thought I had entrusted it in the hands of a person who had more regard to the dictates of honor, and justice than to take the undue advantage you have done of the confidence and trust I reposed in you. But I find I was mistaken, and after being at the great trouble and expense of making a design, paying for paper, printing, etc., and find myself in the most ungenerous manner deprived not only of any proposed advantage, but even of the expense I have been at, as truly as if you had plundered me on the highway. So, okay, that's a pretty direct letter. You stole my image from me, and it cost me something to make it. Not only am I not making money off the image, but I'm out money for what it took me to make it in the first place. Who knew? So that's a little extra level of emotion added to the image, but clearly that was really effective propaganda that then and ever after communicates on behalf of both Pelham and Revere an emotion about that event. Even the fact that we call it the Boston Massacre, some might say that that phrase in and of itself is propaganda. Whenever I say that, I am immediately transported back to, I believe, 8th grade. And my history teacher in 8th grade was making that point, that the phrase Boston Massacre was propaganda, but she wanted us to weigh in on it. So she asked the class, like, what do you make of that phrase, Boston Massacre? Is that realistic or is that not? And all these people in the class were like, no, that's propaganda, because that was the lesson. Little me was like, yeah, but people were killed in the street. That's a massacre. Like, that's not propaganda at all. That was not what the right answer to that question at that particular moment. But whenever I think of the Boston Massacre, that is what I think of. Sometimes propaganda is complicated. So that's a really obvious case of a piece of art with a clear message, good guys, bad guys, looking to get empathy, to compel people to take sides, to get emotion going from that image. Another example, less well known, although I've talked about it in one way or another before, has to do with the election of 1800. Flip here to my piece of paper. So the election of 1800, when I sat down this morning to prepare this topic, first I thought Boston Massacre, and then I thought propaganda. I know, Jefferson, the election of 1800, and burying Bibles. That's a good example too. And indeed, what happens surrounding the election of 1800 is the Federalists, who are terrified beyond measure for any number of reasons about the idea of a Republican, heaven forbid Jefferson, becoming president, they begin spreading essentially propaganda, ideas that are intended to terrify the populace into the horrible consequences of what will happen if Thomas Jefferson becomes president. So there are stories being told, and they're effective. So for example, and the stories in and of themselves don't sound too horrific, but if you could transport yourself to 1799 or 1800, they might be more horrific. So for example, there's a story being told that says, this is from a newspaper, your great philosopher and statesman, Mr. Jefferson, is rather farther gone in infidelity than I am, this says, and tells a story about how this person and Jefferson were riding through the countryside, that Jefferson pointed to, this person pointed to a church that was breaking down, falling apart, expressed shock that the parishioners would allow it to fall into such disrepair, and supposedly Jefferson said, it's good enough for him that was born in a manger. Now, that actually isn't a horrific statement, right? I mean, that actually is a statement about Jesus and humility, but if you already are suspicious of Jefferson as someone who is irreligious and not properly Christian, that story can end up having an impact that now my offering it to you, it might not have. There were lots of stories and anecdotes about Jefferson that were being spread by Federalists with the deliberate intent of terrifying the wits out of Americans so that they would not vote for Republicans, would not support Jefferson in any way. So for example, there were indeed in New England, some New Englanders who were burying their Bibles in their gardens or hanging them down wells to hide them from the horror of horrors. What would happen if there was a Republican regime, if Jefferson came to power? He's so scary. He's irreligious. He's not properly Christian. He doesn't visibly go to church. We never see him in church. He says all these scary philosophical things that seem not Christian in the slightest. So people were literally scared. There's a story, and it's probably apocryphal and not real, but I'm going to tell you anyway. There's a story that one Connecticut woman who was not satisfied to just bury her Bible or hide it by lowering it down into the top part of a well, that she took her Bible to a Republican in her town. And the Republican supposedly said, "My good woman, if all the Bibles are to be destroyed, what is the use of bringing yours to me?" And supposedly the woman said, "Keep it. They'll never think of looking for a Bible in the house of a Democratic Republican." So it's a little funny joke, but still puts you in the mind of what that moment would have been like when people were literally afraid that scary, unchristian President Thomas Jefferson would do something horrible and the nation would become unchristian as a whole. For a lot of the 1790s, there was a lot of that talk about Jefferson, particularly in the late 1790s. I must offer you a great example of Yale President Timothy Dwight in 1798, looking ahead to what might happen in the next election. So Dwight says that if Republicans gain power, and this is all a quote, "we may behold a strumpet personating a goddess on the altars of Jehovah. The Bible will be cast into a bonfire, the vessels of the sacramental supper borne by an ass in public procession, and our children, either wheedled or terrified, uniting in chanting mockeries against God." He's to this list of horrors, he then added, "we may see our wives and daughters the victims of legal prostitution." Right now, this seems a little far-fetched, but this is the president of Yale holding forth before people, making these kinds of declarations. One of the things about propaganda is that particularly when it comes from sources of authority, whether that means a government or government officials or some kind of formal news publication, it takes on a legitimacy, so that as far-fetched as it may seem, it's still in one way or another is possibly credible. And if it's even possibly credible, it can have a big impact. That's, that statement of Styles is so over the top. However, even if you believe a tiny hint of it, like, there might be something funny about this Jefferson character, maybe not that bad, it's going to have the impact that Styles clearly was hoping it would have. I have to add to that something that, and I've probably mentioned it before, I'm not sure, but many moons ago, probably like 20 years ago, I had a student, a senior, who wrote his senior essay on what it was like to be at Yale during this time period and not be a Federalist. He was trying to see what Yale did to create proper young Federalists at this time. And one of the things he found these notebooks from students, notes of the lectures and courses that they were in. There's a handful of them, and they're still at Yale, which is kind of amazing. And one of the things that he found, and I'm not going to do it justice, but it's close to this. It was a student in a rhetoric class of some kind. And in that case, I guess, let me get here. It was Dwight, I guess. I don't think it was Styles. I think it was Dwight. Was teaching this rhetoric class, and he was offering examples to the students, like, suppose this, then what, to help them in reasoning. And the examples that he tended to use, like, suppose this. One of them was, suppose that the president of the United States is an infidel and a radical who will destroy Christianity. And the students in their notebook are right, suppose president is an atheist and an infidel. So in the notebook, the students are transcribing this, clearly whoever the heck this Jefferson guy is, he's bad. And then moving on as though it's just a random example. That's a teacher who sort of is imposing a clear message with his students, but still same general idea. So that's, a great example of propaganda that, certainly Jefferson was free spoken on religion in some ways. He was influenced by France, and for Federalists, what was going on in France was frightening for social and political and religious reasons as well. It was scary and radical. So there were any number of things that Jefferson did to at least allow that kind of idea to move on and exist and have some credibility in some way. But a lot of the belief was really just the effectiveness of Federalists at fear mongering, at getting people terrified of what might happen. And as I just said a moment ago, even if they only believe a little tiny bit of that, they're going to be scared, they're going to be nervous, they're not going to be sure what to do. And if you can get people in that kind of fearful, nervous, distrustful mindset where they're not sure what's going on and they're on the lookout for things that look suspicious, you're priming people for more propaganda, right? You're priming them to be on the lookout for bad things happening, and in this case, on the other side, right? The Federalists are kind of suggesting, Jefferson and his friends, something's not right about them. I don't necessarily believe all of that rhetoric and stuff being tossed out about Jefferson, although some people clearly did. But even if I don't believe all of it, there's something, what is the old cliche where there's smoke, there's fire, right? Something isn't right. And so you've got a population of people who are primed for more propaganda and to not entirely trust Jefferson, and thus already to see Jefferson and his allies as the other. So that's effective. That's effective propaganda, even if people don't 100% buy into it. Now, obviously, that brings us back to today. I see I'm running out of time and I want to open things up to questions. It brings us back to today, in which, there's all kinds of propaganda, and some of it is strategic fake news meant as propaganda. Some of it is just actually political cartoons and such that are aimed at getting people worked up either in support of what the cartoon says or to respond against what the cartoon says, and in so doing to spread its message. And a great example of that, there was, if I had been really ahead of the game, I would have gotten images of things to show you, and yet I wasn't this week, so I apologize. Supposedly there was at some point, and this is a meme, last week I said in some ways maybe social media memes are kind of an equivalent of a political cartoon, and this anecdote suggests maybe there's some credibility to that. Supposedly there was a meme posted at some point by the Republican Party of Texas, so it was formally coming from them, and get the exact wording here. It showed people on a line, waiting on a long line for COVID tests, and then also waiting on a long line to vote. And the wording said, if you can wait in line for hours for testing, you can vote in person, right? And so in one way or another, it was saying waiting times are acceptable, right? It was making light of the fact that waiting times disproportionately affect communities of color, but it was suggesting, oh, come on, you can wait online for vaccines, you can wait online to vote, big deal. Now, what's interesting about that, and there was a phrase that someone used in relation to it, which I thought was wonderful, so I want to offer it to you. Someone said, a senior researcher at the University of Toronto's Citizen Lab, which tells you what they're interested in, said, quote, "You are being rage farmed." And I love that word, rage farmed. And by that, he meant you're being encouraged to respond angrily to that message, to that tweet, to that meme. And this is another quote, "Your angry quote tweet is the goal." Right? So it's a cartoon that for some people, they're going to believe the message and say, yeah. And then people who don't believe the message are going to be outraged and are going to respond by spreading that message and saying, can you believe this? What a horror this is, what outrage. And then people who like the message in the cartoon can then mock the people who are becoming offended by it. And all together as a whole, they're spreading the message, they're spreading outrage, rage farm, they're creating rage. And as we've seen over and over and over again, and are continuing to see, whatever attempt is being made by somewhere to have reasoned debate, to have actual arguments, to really have a discourse about something, it's being overwhelmed by this sort of quote unquote rage farming to get people stirred up emotionally. And in that kind of a debate, if you're really not worried about policy, people who are willing to play that game most aggressively are going to be at an advantage. And that's kind of where the state of our politics is right now. Now, I tend to try and find some way when I talk about the present to steer us in a direction that perhaps at least won't make things worse. And this, what I have to offer this week, it's obvious, but I'm going to say it anyway. And that is that the rage farm idea is what leads to this. Obviously, and I will say it again, don't just leap off the cliff of emotion when you see these things that are meant to make us leap off the cliff of emotion, right? Don't immediately, and I will totally admit, I do the same thing, right? I'll see something and some part of me will be like, what? I'm outraged, right? To myself, at least. Don't travel too far down that road because that's what you're supposed to be doing. And the second half of this is don't simply repeat it, even if you're expressing outrage about it. And I know that's hard to do. And I myself on Twitter, on social media, sometimes have to really fight the impulse to say, do you know what they're saying? Because you're just spreading their message and giving them a victory. I try really hard to say things like, someone out there on social media is making a claim that, you know, sort of is moving in this direction. And we all know that that's ridiculous, so that I'm not being emotional and I'm not repeating the lie. But in one way or another, I would say, don't let yourself be rage farmed, right? There's a lot of rage farming going on right now. And the goal is to make people angry. And in making them angry, to taint the public discourse, to remove it from being about issues, to divide people by making them take sides, right? If the them is that horrible, then I'm really going to be part of the us. So it's divisive by making people feel that they need to band together to be against the evil other. In all of these ways, this kind of propaganda is dangerous, not just in the specific message that it sends, but in the way that it encourages people to think, to come together, to push apart. It's dangerous in any number of ways. And I feel like on a daily basis, we see that in action. So the rage farming is such a great phrase. I throw that out there because maybe that remembering that idea will keep you from becoming the epitome of that idea, that we should not allow ourselves to be rage farmed. We should think before we respond. We should strategically respond to things that are aimed at getting us mad by not giving them what they want, not repeating the offensive thing that led us to get mad, but actually thinking about the aim of what's happening there and maybe talking about that. Oh, this looks like people who want this. This looks like people, wow, interesting that this image really downplays the impact of long lines on communities of color where there are exceedingly longer lines than in many other places. So there are smart ways to respond to propaganda, but they're best used when you first realize the propaganda for what it is and think about the way that you're going to respond to it. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there. I'm like even 1 minute over, but and I glanced down. Yes, Carolee said mug. I will have the mug. I do want to say mug all across the bottom of my screen here. I did just see the phrase serious consequences. Yeah, I know, newbie. I'm going to get to the mug right away, I promise. But it is true that what I'm talking about here, as far as propaganda, can indeed have very serious consequences, violent consequences. So as I'm talking about thinking things through, not letting yourself be taken in or swept away with emotion, I don't want to hide the fact that that simple and yet vital fact that propaganda can lead to, and often does lead to, violence, danger, bad things that once they begin are difficult to stop. So for a lot of reasons, really important to think about rage farming, to not get caught up in propaganda, to think of the smart way to respond and to expose it for what it is. Okay, now I will mug. Mug. And this was kind of obvious. So, and I know I've used it before. At this point, I always feel like it's vaguely anticlimactic, my mugs, because I don't really have new mugs. I'm going to have to somehow or other get mugs to surprise you with. Like, ha, you haven't seen this one before. There is a NPR program called On the Media, which talks about how media is discussing various things. So it really is about the how of how things are being communicated. So this is my onthemedia.org mug, although what it says is on caffeine. So it's appropriate for us. It's on the media and on caffeine, although I will confess I am drinking iced tea this morning because I did not even have time to get coffee. So it's not as good as my normal caffeine. However, that is my topical mug, my on the media mug, and an NPR plug. Exactly. Excellent. Okay. Grace, there you are. Oh, okay. We have, this is a different background than we had a moment ago, is it? Or is it the same one?
Yeah, I didn't like the other one was more pixelated. I didn't like that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Excellent.
so I switched it out, but I was still going with just some sort of classic World War I images. I saw somebody was asking in the chat about in fact maybe we even lead with that. Someone was asking about what happens when propaganda is integrated as part of US policy, as it was during World War I,
Well,
when you
right.
have whole committees working on it, on this
Right.
playing on emotion.
During wars, right? I mean,
Right.
during real wars and quasi wars, right? During all kinds of wars. In a sense, for patriotic purpose, you can, as the government, you can argue, I suppose, if you want to, my mug down here, that that's necessary because you have to have the people behind you if you're engaged in war. But that's a dangerous argument to make in and of itself, because what you're trying to do is get people engaged in a war that maybe they don't necessarily support. So it's true that propaganda is at its most powerful when it comes from particularly the government or something supported by the government. We live in an age when national institutions of all kinds are being attacked and stripped down and exposed in a variety of ways so that people won't trust them anymore. That said, even so, when a national institution or a government institution says something, we don't necessarily automatically believe it. And the CDC is a great example of that now, that we're all confused about what we're supposed to be doing. And so we are all confused about some of the things that the government says. These are confusing times. But that said, it is still true that if a government institution or a leading government figure says something, automatically it has a level of credibility that has to be reckoned with, and that make it more effective and thus potentially more dangerous.
Yes, that was definitely one of the questions. And actually, I keep wanting to tell the CDC, there was a time when people used good art. Like, try using good art.
That's true.
They've got a lot of examples of the government effectively moving people's emotions. Come on, CDC, get your propaganda game together. So we do have, again, lots. This is really something that people are very, very, very interested in. All right. Yeah, so I mean, I suppose that's Gloria's question, which is sort of related to that. Is propaganda a bad word? Are there cases in which propaganda can be a good thing?
Right. Well, that's a really good question, because let's think of an example like playing on people's emotions to get them to buy war bonds. So, do you support the war? I don't know, the propaganda wants you to emotionally so that you will buy war bonds to support the war effort. I don't know if I'd say that's necessarily good, but it's not as blatantly evil, I suppose, as we're going to say something horrible so you hate these people or this guy or this cause. So I think I think there are shades of bad. Let me put it that way. Propaganda is about persuasion through emotion. And that can be done, I suppose, for some causes that are more praiseworthy than others. But that said, no matter what it's for or against, that's what it's about, is emotion. And so I guess more than anything, that's what I would say about it, is it can be used for good purpose, but it's still, in that sense, I don't want to say sneaky, but
It's manipulation.
Exactly. That's the good word. It's a way of manipulating you into thinking something because you're feeling something. So yeah.
Can be used to a good end that perhaps we all approve of, but
Right.
is in fact
it still is
form of manipulation.
Manipulation is the perfect word. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Tom says, would the British depiction of Bostonians in distress be considered the same level of propaganda as the Boston Massacre engraving?
I'm sorry, I missed the first half of that. The
Would a, so I'm not sure if there is actually one. Would a British depiction of
oh,
Bostonians in distress, which
I
sounds a little more
see.
mild, I think, be considered the same level of propaganda as the Boston Massacre engraving? Is there actually a Bostonians in distress image, Tom?
This is from Tom. Um, there is, Tom says. Okay. I mean, it depends. In that case, is there a link to it? Bostonians in distress. There
Look
is.
at that.
You guys. Okay, I have to click on it now because I need to see. Oh, okay. So that's a British Bostonians in distress. Well, I mean, in that if it's being made for, so it's Bostonians. There you are. You're showing us. Do this. Here we go. It's a London image. Bostonians are in a cage hanging from a liberty tree. And well, in this case, if this is coming from Brits who are sensitive to the American cause and are trying to encourage sympathy for it, then yeah, I guess that could count as propaganda. I mean, it. This gets us back to cartoons, right? That cartoons, in one way or another, sometimes that they're meant to make you think, huh? And in some cases, they're meant to move you or persuade you by getting your emotion going, in which case they sort of veer into the propaganda zone. So yeah, I mean, I think it is something we often don't think about. And when I teach my American Revolution course, I try and be attuned to this, is that just like there's no single founder blob, there was no single British blob as to what they believed about what was going on in the colonies, right? So there were a lot of people who believed one thing. There were other people who were sympathetic to what the colonists were doing. And that's an important thing to bear in mind too. So that fact that there were different views in England about what was going on in the colonies, the answer to the question would be, well, yeah, if someone in England is making that cartoon to try and persuade people to feel sympathy for the Bostonians in distress, you could say it, yeah, in a sense, that's propaganda. It's trying to encourage you to feel sympathetic for them, I would say. So I don't know if that's the answer you were looking for, but I think,
Interesting.
yeah.
And thank you for sharing a parallel primary source there, Tom.
I know.
It's a
Look at
fun
that.
little jaunt. Good little history jaunt. All right. So Dale wants to know, would common sense fall into the propaganda category, especially as Washington has read it to the troops?
Ooh, that's a good question, and I thought about that this morning. In some ways, you could say yes, because even the title, what Paine was trying to do there was shake people up and get them to really think about monarchy, generally speaking, the American situation, but monarchy more generally. And he said things in a very basic way. He didn't use highfalutin terminology. He sometimes said things that were deliberately funny. So is it like, I'm going to be outrageous and get people to think what I think? Well, maybe a little, but it was aimed at provoking a really strong response in Americans to get them to do something that was really difficult for people to do. And that was rethink their attachment to the king, because that was the real hurdle towards moving towards independence, was just the fact that, American colonists, this was the king, this was their king. They felt loyal to him, and they might be able to convince themselves that Parliament was behaving in a corrupt manner, or that the king had corrupt advisors of some way, but being loyal to the king was the essence of considering yourself a British subject. So that last break was a hard thing to accomplish, and that's really what Paine was trying to do in the appropriately named Common Sense. It's just common sense. Mm-hmm. What is a king? The royal brute. What is a king? The king's not something special. And in that case, it was amazingly effective in that it really forced people, or at least urged them, encouraged them, and enabled them to rethink what a king was and what it meant to be loyal to a king, and to acknowledge the fact that kings behave badly and don't necessarily have your best interest in mind, and that matters. So common sense, I think it's John Adams who there's a quote that I'm not going to do justice to, in which he says, like, in this amount of time, that one pamphlet just exploded what people thought about monarchy, about the king, about the cause, about the revolution. So as something deliberately written to provoke not just thoughts, but also an emotional response to the situation, I guess you could say it kind of falls into that category. I think and this is part of what I was finding this morning when I was Googling around, trying to see how a variety of different organizations and institutions that study propaganda or misinformation or disinformation, how they define things. What I found is that there's a huge gray area there, and that there's a lot of disagreement. And the fact that there's a gray area is part of what's significant here, right? Is that some things you could say, well, obviously that's propaganda, right? So you can point to the Paul Revere engraving. Other things, it's like, well, okay, yeah, it was, common sense isn't necessarily lying, right? It's not, it contains truth in it, but it does it in an emotional kind of a way that's supposed to be pushing people to respond. Is that propaganda? I don't know. Some people might argue that it is. It got people to rethink something, but it also got them emotionally engaged in the rethinking of it. So I think there's a gray area, and I think that's a dangerous thing about propaganda. You can argue like, oh, it's just fact, right? We're just arguing, just talking about the king.
Or are there some things where we frankly should have an emotional response to, and need to be made aware of things? So it is tricky. It's pretty interesting. All right. So we do have, as you know, you have many loyal readers in the audience. So James says, I don't recall from Field of Blood an extensive discussion of how propaganda fueled or intensified the violence in Congress leading up to the Civil War. Any examples come to mind?
Oh, propaganda leading up to the Civil War. I'm trying to think of specific examples. Well, there was a lot of, the first thing that comes to mind is just there was a lot of humor making fun of Congress because they were just not up to the task. But for sure, so let me put it this way. For sure, there were different things aimed at spreading messages of propaganda, like intention. So for example, the idea that the Southerners really wanted to spread the idea that the North, they act like they're so superior to us and that they have better technology than us and that they're smarter than us, and they're not. We all know they're not. And so there were a lot of people telling stories and giving public speeches about the ways in which the North is not superior at all, which led into this dangerous sort of, the war will be over in no time. They're a bunch of Yankee chickens up there and we can beat them. So, in a way, you could say that was a kind of propagandistic, if that's a word, message aimed at getting people to assume that, they're not so great up there in the North. We can beat them, no problem. I'm trying to think of a specific example, though. And most of what's coming to mind is people making fun of Congress more than anything else. Certainly there was discussion and depictions in the North of barbaric Southerners in the South, right? And that's the word they like to use, was barbarian, barbaric. And there were, again, propaganda or not, like there was a book, and it's lurking behind me, and I'm not going to turn around and get it because I will have to turn my back to you, but there were collections of horrible anecdotes about slavery and enslaved people, just collected together, like here, the barbarity of slavery, right? That just a whole hundreds of anecdotes that are horrific. This is what slavery is. Slavery is horrible, and I'm assuming that a good number of those stories are probably true in this particular collection. Is that propaganda? Well, it was aimed at having an emotional response on the part of readers. It wasn't necessarily, fake news. It was potentially true, but it was aimed at gearing people up emotionally. That falls into that kind of gray zone.
Yeah, like Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Yeah, exactly.
And there's actually another note in the questions here that we often think about cartoons, but they're asking about, isn't this also, early propaganda also looks like pamphlets and almanacs, like in the example here is the anti-slavery almanac.
It's true. And there's an interesting, some of you might know an early book by Bernard Bailyn called The Ideological Origins of the American Revolution. And that book came about. It's a major book in early American history because Bailyn did something kind of shocking related to what we're talking about here. He was asked to read hundreds of pamphlets and Revolutionary era pamphlets. And as he was reading through these pamphlets, they all were talking about, evil plots and the king out to get them and the evil ministers and all of this kind of stories about what was really going on in England. And Balin asked a really interesting question. He said, people, we tend to read these pamphlets and we think, oh, they're all just, it's a bunch of propaganda, like they're just spreading these stories around. Balin said, what if people actually believed some of that? What if what we're looking at actually is people attesting to the fact that this is what they thought? Really interesting question, and got people to think about and read these Revolutionary era pamphlets in a different way. And it's a smart question, right? You can't assume when you're reading something, any early American, in my case, early American evidence, you might want to or be tempted to read it and be like, well, I couldn't really, I didn't believe that. Like they must have all, but part of, for me, the thrill of research is encountering things that don't make sense and trying to figure out if they actually did make sense to the people reading them or writing them at the time. And so Balin asking that question, what if we don't assume it's all propaganda? What if we actually think about the fact that maybe they actually believe some of this? It makes a lot of things look very different. So it another way in which thinking about propaganda, what is and what isn't propaganda, can be a really invaluable tool in interpreting the news and also history.
Yeah, and in fact, that it may be impossible to right some injustices without engaging emotion.
Well, right.
So, yeah,
exactly.
Fun and tricky. Fun and tricky.
Fun and tricky. Well, right. And in some cases, how can you not engage emotion? If you're writing about lynching,
right?
If you're writing about lynching and you want people to understand what it is, there damn well better be emotion involved in that. It's horrific, right? I mean, it is. It just is. As a matter of fact, I was going to save this to the after party. I won't. It's my Ida B. Wells Barbie doll.
Oh, I saw that was coming out.
I am such a fan of Ida B. Wells and her journalism and her bravery. But there's a great example of her using facts and figures in addition to her reporting to talk about something horrific and show it for what it was. So look at that. I got Ida B. Wells and a Barbie doll worked in. So anyway.
So Becky wants to know, I think when we're thinking about propaganda, what we've been talking about so far are specific pieces, cartoons, images. And she wonders if just, as she mentions, weasel wording is her phrase. And she wonders if just, she's calling it twisted or inferred language, just straight up language in itself could be considered propaganda if it's being used for those same sort of emotionally manipulative aims.
Sure. I think for sure that could be, I mean, it's part of why I teach my students this, right? When they're looking at historical artifacts, to think about the wording in addition to the message and the content and the format and everything else, to think about words, because there are words that are, you can choose any number of different words, and some of them have more of a emotional or persuasive or some kind of it's going to evoke from you something more powerful than something else. So yeah, I do think sometimes word choice makes something more into a mode of deliberate, playing on your emotion to spread a message, kind of propaganda. Part of the problem of what we're talking about here this morning is the word propaganda, right? Which in some ways, it's just like, propaganda is something that people of authority use to mislead and rile up the populace, which is a true way of understanding it. What do you do then with things that are deliberately aimed at getting people to understand a horrific situation? It isn't necessarily propaganda, but as I said, there's kind of a spectrum, I guess, a propaganda spectrum, or a spectrum of ways in which people appeal to emotion. And the word propaganda and the meaning of propaganda is one part of the spectrum, but that doesn't mean, as with lynching, that everything that you write that touches people's emotions necessarily counts as propaganda.
Well, is that authority piece crucial for what we're talking about? Because that's different. If you're manipulating emotions from a position of power, that's different. There's a difference there.
I want to find the exact wording here. Blah blah blah. To be sure that I'm doing justice to what I found here. Because I do think that that's part of it. But it doesn't have to be part of it. So if propaganda is information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote or publicize a particular political cause or point of view, that's pretty broad and sweeping. But I think it maybe the way to put it is at its most dangerous and most powerful when it is deployed by a government or government institution or some formal source of authority that can claim to be just issuing a public statement that doesn't have an underlying meaning, in which it actually does. So maybe that's just the most dangerous form of propaganda.
And I'm not actually even sure when the word started being used as such, but Clinton wants to know if there, if there was a negative connotation to this idea of propaganda before World War II, say, or did people just think of this as a type of persuasion and everybody did it, so there wasn't that same negative connotation to it?
If I remember correctly, and it's been 1,000 years since I looked this up. I mean, propaganda is an idea that certainly predates that.
Yeah.
But I want to say it's the early 20th century when people first began sort of studying what it was and what it could do, that it predates World War II. And I can't remember for the life of me. I mean, I'm now talking about research I did for my dissertation in I don't know, 1990, whatever. But there were some texts about propaganda that were sort of seminal texts at the time talking about what it really was. And I want to say that they're early 20th century. And it's important to say, and I've sort of vaguely seen floating along in the chat on the side, the idea of propaganda, the use of propaganda it goes back forever. So it's not a modern phenomenon. What is more a modern phenomenon is the way that we're sort of sociologically analyzing it and trying to figure out what it does. But
we're being very modern.
Yeah, exactly. We're very, very modern to sort of, try and analyze. But it has been around forever. And for good reason, right? It's really effective and it's hard to counter, right? If people get their emotion bound up with something, it's hard to undo that. It can be very hard to undo that. And that's part of the danger of it.
Thank you. And
actually, Anissa, I hope I'm saying your name correctly, is absolutely correct that ease of distribution has increased its effectiveness. And that's absolutely true, right? Because social media in and of itself, memes, I mean, something like gets beamed out, and if it gets some kind of a response, positive or negative, it'll be everywhere, right? And then it'll become in and of itself a topic of news, right? So the propaganda becomes news, and then that maybe inspires more. You can see like a cycle that is born of the ease with which this kind of stuff is spread now, and how difficult it can be to counter it. I mean, I've talked at some point in the past, at this point, 97 episodes. Sometimes I have to go screening through the past episodes to see, have I talked about this before? We did at one point talk about the press, and we talked about fake news and how difficult it can be to prove news is fake, right? And I talked about that in early America as well. People spreading stories, like in the election of 1800, Thomas Jefferson died, right? And people for a brief period, people being like, oh, Thomas Jefferson, the candidate for president, has died. This is horrible. And how do you counter that? How do you find a way to have the truth move in the same path that the lie moved? So I know, exactly. It's like a Monty Python skit. I'm not dead. I'm not dead yet. Actually, that is from The Life of Brian. Okay, I'm always saving this.
There are some questions here about news, and they're actually coming in sort of three different streams, and let's see if I can work these ideas together. So Dale is wondering about, now we divide things in some papers. It's clear that there's some things that are opinion and there's some things that are labeled news. Were those delineations in history always clear? And actually, has there ever really been news? Because doesn't news always play on emotions?
Well, I mean, it's a really interesting question, particularly, and of course I'm biased, particularly in early America, because objectivity, an objective press is not part of the goal in early American journalism, right? You, as if you are a political party, group, cause, whatever, you want a newspaper to be your organ and spread your message, and that's what you do. And it's aimed very deliberately to be partisan. Now, really good partisan press organs can sort of preach about being open to all messages and then not really be open to all messages. So like I remember finding at the Massachusetts Historical Society a long string of letters from someone who was trying to get a Federalist, essentially op-ed, a Federalist opinion of something going on in a Republican newspaper. And because the Republican newspaper claimed, like, we are open to all arguments, right? We're being fair. And they never took what he wanted to offer. And he was like, they're not fair. They're not open, right? They're claiming it, but they're not. So, news in early America was in and of itself a problematic idea, because no one absolutely knew for sure when you read the newspaper if what was in it was really true or not. And when you read these newspapers and they'll say things like, a friend of mine just returned from Boston on this trip, a gentleman says, and they're trying to make you believe what it says by saying, no, I know this person, he was a friend and he's a gentleman and he was there. They're always trying to find ways in newspapers in this period to get you to understand that what's being said here is truth, even if it isn't. But because of the very obviously partisan nature of so much of the press, some of newspapers are explicitly commercial and are really about trade, and some are just about politics and are really propounding one particular cause in one way or another. Because of that, when Congress is in session, there are all kinds of people who write to their member of Congress who's on the spot within the national government to tell them, like, what's really happening. Like, you're there and you can see what's happening in the nation because you're with a bunch of other people. So tell us in a personal letter with your signature on it, what's really happening. And when Congress goes out of session and the government is not in operation, you see all these frantic letters between people saying, I don't know what's happening. Like, I can't believe the newspapers. So now I don't know what's happening. Someone shed light. So it's a problem, news as something that we assume, and for a little while maybe assumed was trustworthy and unbiased. We're no longer sort of in that realm, but we were for a time. That was not yet I always say on the radar screen, which makes no sense for like 1790, but still, that was not in the realm of what was going on. And it was assumed that, and that's why they called it a party organ, a sort of living thing that was going to promote your message. So news has always been a complicated category throughout American history. And once again, it has become that again, partly because of technology. Oh, I see, I've actually moved us beyond the hour mark here.
This is a good topic. And by the way, we do have a suggested topic of patriotism as a future episode.
Ooh, okay, okay, I'll think about that one. That's a big topic, yeah.
And James, sorry for messing up your question, but I think it turned out okay.
Hopefully it turned out okay. Okay. I don't want to keep folks too long, so I will conclude by saying, as I often do, thank you guys. Thank everyone for coming week after week, week 97, to engage in the process of democracy, talking about what's going on now, how we can think about it, and how history can help us wrangle with and grapple with the present. I really appreciate that we're doing this every week for so long, right? I find that so encouraging that we're doing this in this way for this reason, which is part of why I say this every week, that thank you for doing this and for coming for this. What we are now going to segue into is the after party. And what that means, if you beamed in here through NCHE, through their website, just stay right where you are, and someone's going to get bingo right now, and poof, you will instantly be in the after party. All that it means is that we will stop recording in the way that we are now, and so we can be a little freer in what we're saying because we will not be recorded as we say it. If you are watching on Facebook and you want to join the after party, you need to leave Facebook and join through the NCHE website. The link is ncheteach.org/ conversations. And then you too can poof, be in the after party. With that, I will say everyone have a safe, healthy, happy week. And I will, if you're not sticking around for the after party, I will see you guys in a week.
You all. And do make sure you register for the NCHE conference, March 17th through 20th at ncheteach.org/conference. And one of the evening events will be History Matters, and so do cocktails. That will be open to the public as well. So get excited for all of those events. All right. Thank you all very much. And we're now going to disappear and go to the after party.